More specifically, he thought that an aversive emotional state, dissonance, is aroused whenever people experience inconsistency between two cognitions, and when the cognitions are about our own behavior. I just failed to live up to my promise. We're troubled by the inconsistency between our cognitions and our behavior as well. This unpleasant emotional state motivates efforts to restore consistency, typically by changing the cognition to make it more consistent with the behavior. Cognitive dissonance theory, the theory that inconsistency between a person's thoughts, sentiments, and actions creates an aversive emotional state, dissonance, that leads to efforts to restore consistency. What constitutes cognitive inconsistency, and under what conditions does it arise? What are the different ways that people try to get rid of inconsistency? Festinger's theory has inspired a tremendous amount of research aimed at answering such questions. To get a better sense of the kinds of inconsistency people find troubling, as well as a flavor for the diverse phenomena cognitive dissonance theory can explain, let's look at some of the classic experiments on the subject. It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Decisions and dissonance. A mere moment's reflection tells us that all hard decisions cause some feelings of dissonance. Because the decision is hard, the rejected alternative must have some desirable features. The chosen alternative must have some undesirable features, or both. Because these elements are inconsistent with the decision made, the result is dissonance. If you move to Los Angeles from a small town in the Midwest in pursuit of good weather, you'll enjoy the sun, but the hours spent in traffic will probably produce dissonance. According to Festinger, once you've made an irrevocable decision to move to LA, you'll exert effort to reduce this dissonance. You'll rationalize. You'll tell yourself and your friends how much you've learned from the audiobooks you play in your car during your long commute. Many experiments have documented this tendency for people to rationalize their decisions. In one study, researchers interviewed bettors at a racetrack, some just before and just after placing their bets. The investigators reasoned that the act of placing a bet and irrevocably choosing a particular horse would cause the bettors to reduce the dissonance associated with the chosen horse's negative features, doesn't do well on a wet track, and the positive features of the competing horses, the perfect distance for one horse, the best jockey on another. Dissonance reduction should be reflected in greater confidence on the part of those interviewed right after placing their bets, once rationalization has set in. Indeed, bettors who were interviewed right before they placed their bets gave their horses, on average, a fair chance of winning. Those interviewed after they had placed their bets gave their horses, on average, a good chance to win. Earthquake rocks Southern California. Why would anyone live there? Bitter cold sweeps Northeast. Why would anyone live there? One participant provided some extra commentary that illustrates the process of dissonance reduction especially well. Having been interviewed while waiting in line, before placing his bet, he approached another member of the research team after placing his bet and said, "Are you working with that other fellow there? Well, I just told him that my horse had a fair chance of winning. Will you have him change that to a good chance? No, by God, make that an excellent chance." Similar findings have been reported in studies of elections. Voters express greater confidence in their candidates when interviewed after they voted than when interviewed right beforehand. Festinger argued that dissonance reduction takes place only after an irrevocable decision has been made, that is, a decision that can't be undone. He maintained, for example, that there is a clear and undeniable difference between the cognitive processes that occur during the period of making a decision and those that occur after the decision has been made. Reevaluation of alternatives in the direction of favoring the chosen or disfavoring the rejected alternative is a post-decision phenomenon. Rationalizing decisions, reducing dissonance. After placing a bet at the track, as here at the Kentucky Derby, people are likely to concentrate on the positive features of the horse they bet on and downplay any negatives. This rationalization process gives them greater confidence in the choice they made. The evidence from the betting and election studies supports Festinger's contention, but this seems at odds with other things we know about people. One of humankind's distinguishing characteristics is the ability to anticipate the future. If, in the process of making a decision, we see blemishes associated with what is emerging as our favorite option, why not start the process of rationalization beforehand to minimize or eliminate dissonance altogether? Indeed, more recent research suggests that the same sorts of rationalization and distortion that occur after people make a decision also subconsciously take place before they make the decision, whether choosing restaurants, vacation spots, consumer goods, or political candidates. Once people develop a slight preference for one option over the others, they distort subsequent information to support their preference. Thus, the small size of a particular Italian restaurant tends to be rated as a plus by those leaning toward Italian food, it's nice and intimate, but as a minus by those leaning toward a burger joint. We won't be able to talk without everyone overhearing us. So Festinger was right in maintaining that decisions evoke dissonance and then dissonance reduction, but these processes seem to occur more broadly than he anticipated. They take place both before and after decisions are made. Effort justification. The tendency to reduce dissonance by justifying the time, effort, or money devoted to something that turned out to be unpleasant or disappointing. Leon Festinger. In studying how people bring their attitudes in line with their behavior, Leon Festinger developed cognitive dissonance theory. Effort justification. The element of dissonance theory that rings most true to many people is the idea that if you pay a high price for something, in dollars, time, or effort, and it turns out to be disappointing, you'll probably experience dissonance. As a result, you're likely to devote mental energy to justifying what you've done. This tendency is known as effort justification. This sort of sweet lemons rationalization, it's really not so bad, can be seen in many contexts. Those who don't have pets often suspect that pet lovers exaggerate the pleasure they get from their animals to offset all the early morning walking, poop scooping, and furniture wrecking. And those who choose not to have children suspect that sleep-deprived, overtaxed parents are fooling themselves when they say that nothing in life brings greater joy. Researchers explored the role of dissonance reduction in such situations in an early study in which female undergraduates signed up for an experiment thinking it involved the opportunity to join an ongoing discussion group about sex. When they arrived, however, the students were told that not everyone can speak freely and comfortably about such a topic, so potential participants had to pass a screening test to join the group. Those assigned to a control condition simply read aloud a list of innocuous words to the male experimenter. Those assigned to a mild initiation condition read aloud a list of mildly embarrassing words, such as prostitute, petting, and virgin. Finally, those in a severe initiation group read aloud a list of obscene words and a passage from a novel describing sexual intercourse. All participants were then told they had passed the screening test and could join the group. The group was meeting that very day, but participants were told that because everyone else in the discussion group had been given a reading assignment beforehand, it was best if they just listened in on the discussion. Then, through headphones in a nearby cubicle, they heard a very boring discussion of the sex life of invertebrates. Not only was the topic not what they had in mind when they signed up for a discussion group about sex, but the discussion group members contradicted themselves and one another, mumbled several non sequiturs, started sentences that they never finished, hemmed, hawed, and in general conducted one of the most worthless and uninteresting discussions unimaginable. The investigators predicted that the discussion would be boring and disappointing to all the participants, but that it would produce dissonance only for those who had undergone a severe initiation to join the group. The cognition, "I suffered to get into this group," is inconsistent with the cognition, "this group is worthless and boring." One way for the participants in the severe initiation condition to reduce dissonance would be to convince themselves that the group and the discussion weren't so boring after all. Indeed, when the experimenters asked participants at the end of the study to rate the quality of the discussion they listened to, those in the severe initiation condition rated it more favorably than those in the other two conditions. Figure 7.1, Group Initiation and Liking for the Group. This graph shows the different ratings of a discussion group by participants who experienced no initiation, the control condition, a mild initiation, or a severe initiation to join the group. The participants in the severe initiation condition rated the discussion group most highly, reducing their dissonance. and then the mild initiation condition rated it a tiny bit, probably statistically insignificantly higher than the control group, rated the discussion group. This frat better be worth it. It's a guy surrounded by sharks, tied up underwater. The need to justify costly behavior influences people in other areas of life as well. When people pay for consumer goods in ways that feel costly, think cash or check, they end up being more committed to the product and to the company from which they bought it than when they pay in ways that feel less costly. Think debit or credit cards. And when people have to assemble a product, think IKEA, before they can enjoy it, they end up enjoying it more, as long as the assembly is successful and doesn't result in a torrent of cursing. A closer look: how cognitive dissonance can make you like what you buy. Cognitive dissonance isn't just a laboratory phenomenon. As consumers, businesses, and marketers can attest, it also has widespread influence in real-world contexts, including product choice, consumer satisfaction, and brand loyalty. When a product is more difficult to acquire, people often justify the extra effort by evaluating the product more positively. The IKEA effect. In these studies, some participants assembled IKEA boxes and Lego sets, and then all participants indicated how much they would pay for their own product, a pre-built product, or someone else's finished product. How much is the IKEA piece worth to you on a scale of $0 to $1? Self-built, 78 cents. Other built, 48 cents. Lego study. When it's a pre-built set of Lego, you would bid 32 cents on your own set, and you would only bid 26 cents on your partner's set. And when the participant builds the set of Lego, you would bid 84 cents on your own set, and you would only bid 42 cents on your partner's set, which is a bigger disparity when it's a participant-built set. Pain as a function of payment method. Participants in this study rated how much subjective pain they felt and the emotional attachment they felt toward a mug when paying for it with either cash, for which the loss of money is more vivid and concrete, or a credit card, abstract. How painful is it to pay for a mug on a scale of 0 to 5? When you pay with cash, the pain is 4.09, and when you pay with credit, the pain is only 2.10. What minimum price would you sell the mug for? When you pay with cash, you would sell it for $6.71. When you paid for it with credit, you would sell it for only $3.83. Box 7.2, Not So Fast, Critical Thinking About Surveys versus Experiments. Fraternity, hazing, and commitment. Fraternities try to increase the commitment of members by having them undergo difficult and embarrassing initiation rituals, like the one shown here. They're laying on the ground without shirts with their underwear or something over their heads, maybe underwear. Chun Heisen Michael Deng, a 19-year-old student at Baruch College in New York City, was excited about joining the school's Pi Delta Psi fraternity. Like everyone else in the pledge class, he went on a weekend retreat to the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania with the more senior members of the fraternity. While there, he and his fellow pledges were subjected to a gauntlet-like hazing ritual in which he was blindfolded and required to negotiate a path while being knocked repeatedly to the ground. Michael suffered a major brain trauma from this hazing ritual, and because his fraternity brothers were slow in seeking medical help, he died shortly after his eventual arrival at a nearby hospital. Why would a fraternity do such a thing? To be sure, Michael Deng's death was entirely unintentional, and representatives of the National Pi Delta Psi organization condemn the actions of the Baruch College chapter in no uncertain terms, but dangerous hazing rituals like the one that claimed Michael's life remain common. More than 60 students are known to have died in incidents like this in the United States since 2005, at least 10 of them in initiations by a single national fraternity. Why do fraternities continue to engage in such practices? Cognitive dissonance theory provides one answer. Having pledges undergo a painful initiation ritual can make them, once they've gone through it, more dedicated to the fraternity. After all, it may be hard for someone to walk away from an organization after paying such a stiff price to become a member. Doing so would likely cause a lot of dissonance, which could be reduced by deciding that the fraternity is a wonderful organization, one that is sure to make college a golden time. How can we establish that efforts to reduce that dissonance really do lie at the heart of fraternity hazing? Stated differently, how can we determine whether fraternities that have more severe initiations do indeed cultivate more loyalty and enthusiasm among their members? One approach would be to survey members of various fraternities to evaluate their commitment to their fraternity. We could also find out about their initiation practices and have judges, unaware of the purpose of the study, rate them for severity. Do the fraternities with the most severe initiations have the most committed members? Unfortunately, and we hope you've anticipated this, such a survey-based finding wouldn't be informative. It might mean, as dissonance theorists would expect, that undergoing a difficult initiation makes a person feel compelled to embrace the fraternity's virtues, but the finding might instead be the result of the best, most desirable fraternities having the luxury of subjecting their pledges to severe initiations. Maybe it's just that people wouldn't tolerate a severe initiation to get into a less attractive fraternity. This is the correlation versus causation problem. It plagues many empirical studies, and savvy consumers of research findings know how to anticipate it. Only a true experiment, wherein people are randomly assigned to either, say, a mild initiation versus severe initiation condition, could tell us with great confidence whether more painful initiations lead to greater group loyalty than less painful ones. Induced compliance and attitude change. Cognitive dissonance theory can also explain what often happens as a result of induced forced compliance. That is, when people are induced to behave in a manner that's inconsistent with their beliefs, attitudes, or values. Most people will feel some discomfort with the mismatch between the way they've been induced to behave and their attitudes. One way to deal with the inconsistency, the easiest and most likely way, given that the behavior can't be taken back, is for people to change their original attitudes. This was the idea behind President Johnson's strategy, described in the chapter opening. When skeptics publicly defended the administration's position, the inconsistency between their private reservations and their public comments should lead them to dispel their doubts. Induced forced compliance. Subtly compelling people to behave in a manner that is inconsistent with their beliefs, attitudes, or values in order to elicit dissonance and therefore a change in their original attitudes and values. In the first experiment to demonstrate the power of induced compliance to shift people's attitudes, Leon Festinger and Merrill Carlsmith, 1959, had participants in a control condition engage in what can only be described as experimental drudgery for an hour, loading spools on a tray over and over, turning pegs on a pegboard 1/4 turn at a time. Immediately afterward, these participants were asked to rate how much they enjoyed the experiment. They gave quite low ratings. No surprise there. Participants in 2 other conditions also engaged in the boring task, but were subsequently told that the experiment involved how performance on a task is influenced by expectations about it beforehand. These participants were then led to believe they were in a control, no expectation condition, but that other subjects were told beforehand the study was either very interesting or boring. Looking rather sheepish, the experimenter then explained that the next participant was about to show up and needed to be told the study was interesting. This was usually done, the experimenter explained, by a Confederate posing as a participant, but the Confederate was absent, putting the experimenter in a bit of a jam. Would you, the experimenter asked, play the role usually performed by the Confederate and tell the next participant that the experiment is interesting? The experimenter offered the participant either $1 or $20 for doing so. Nearly every participant agreed to the request. In this play within a play, the true participants believed they were Confederates. What was most important to the experiment, and what was readily apparent to the participants, was that they had just been induced to behave in a way that was inconsistent with their true attitude. They lied by saying that a mind-numbingly boring study was interesting. Festinger and Carlsmith predicted that this act would produce dissonance for those participants paid only $1 for the assignment. Their words were inconsistent with their beliefs, and $1 wasn't enough to justify the lie. In contrast, those paid $20 would not have any need to rationalize because the reward was substantial and the lie was of little consequence. To reduce their dissonance, participants in the $1 condition would rationalize their behavior by changing their attitude about the task they had performed. If they convinced themselves the task was interesting after all, their lie wouldn't really be a lie. Consistent with these predictions, when participants in the $1 condition later evaluated their experience, they rated the monotonous tasks more favorably than those in the other conditions. Only the participants in the $1 condition rated the activities above the neutral point, figure 7.2. Induced compliance and attitude change. Saying something we don't believe, and doing so with little justification, $1 instead of $20, produces dissonance. To reduce this dissonance, in this study, the participants in the $1 condition rated the boring task more favorably than participants in the other two conditions, thereby providing some justification for their behavior. They did really lie. Ratings of task enjoyment were made on a -5, extremely dull and boring, to a +5, extremely interesting and enjoyable scale. Ratings of enjoyment tasks. For the $1 experimental condition, they rated it 1.4. For the $20 condition, they rated it 0, and the control rated it 0. One takeaway message from this study is that if you want to persuade people to do something, such as take schoolwork seriously, protect the environment, or refrain from using foul language, and you want them to internalize the broader message behind the behavior, you should use the smallest amount of incentive or coercion necessary to get them to do it. In other words, don't go overboard with the incentives. If the inducements are too big, people will justify their behavior accordingly. It was worth it for the payoff, like participants in Festinger and Carl Smith's $20 condition, and they won't have to rationalize their behavior by coming to believe in the broader purpose or philosophy behind it. But if the inducements are just barely sufficient, as in the $1 condition, their need to rationalize will tend to produce attitude change in line with their behavior. Induced compliance and extinguishing undesired behavior. The flip side of this idea involves the use of mild versus severe punishments. This is illustrated by experiments using what is known as the forbidden toy paradigm. In one such study, a researcher showed nursery children a set of 5 toys and asked them to say how much they liked each one. He then said he would have to leave the room for a bit, but would be back soon. In the meantime, each child was free to play with any of the toys except his or her second favorite. Half the kids were told not to play with the forbidden toy because the experimenter would be annoyed if they did. This was the mild threat condition. In the severe threat condition, if the kids played with the forbidden toy, the experimenter would be very angry and would have to take all the toys and go home and never come back again. While the experimenter was gone, each child was covertly observed, and none played with the forbidden toy. The investigators predicted that not playing with the forbidden toy would produce dissonance, but only for the children in the mild threat condition. For all children, not playing with the toy would be inconsistent with the fact that it was highly desirable, but for those who received the severe threat, the severity of the threat justified not playing with the toy. For children who received only a mild threat, there would be no such justification, producing dissonance, and they would likely resolve the inconsistency by devaluing the toy, convincing themselves it wasn't so great after all. To find out whether these predictions were correct, the children had to reevaluate all 5 toys when the experimenter returned. As expected, those in the severe threat condition either didn't change their opinion of the forbidden toy or liked it even more than before, figure 7.3. In contrast, many of those in the mild threat condition viewed the toy less favorably. Thus, the threat of severe punishment will keep children from doing something you don't want them to do, but they will still, later on, want to do it. The threat of mild punishment, even if it's just enough of a threat to keep them from doing it, can bring about psychological change, such that they'll no longer be tempted to do what you don't want them to do. Contrary to the old adage, you should spare the rod. Figure 7.3, Devaluing the Forbidden Toy. For this study, the graphs show the percentages of children in the mild and severe threat conditions whose opinion of the forbidden toy increased, stayed the same, or decreased. Those who did not play with the toy after receiving a mild threat needed to justify their inaction, so many of them devalued the toy. Those who did not play with the toy because they were severely threatened experienced no dissonance and liked the toy as much as or more than before. So you can see in the mild threat condition that participants liked the toy less after the threat, or liked it the same amount. And in the severe threat condition, participants liked the toy more, or the same amount, after the severe threat. When does inconsistency produce dissonance? Festinger's original insight was that holding two inconsistent cognitions triggers dissonance, but what constitutes inconsistency? And what's so jarringly unpleasant about inconsistency? These questions lead us to wonder which situations are likely to cause dissonance and which ones aren't. Elliot Aronson offered an answer. A given inconsistency will arouse dissonance, Aronson argued, if it implicates our core sense of self. People like to think of themselves as rational, morally upright, worthy individuals, and anything that challenges such assessments tends to produce dissonance. Expending great effort to join a boring group calls into question our wisdom and rationality. Telling another student that a tedious task is interesting challenges our integrity. To understand the sorts of cognitions that might challenge our sense of our good judgment and personal character, it's useful to think about when someone else's actions makes us question that person's character, and also to think of the justifications someone else could offer that would prevent us from questioning that person's judgment or moral fiber. Suppose you ask a tech-savvy friend to help you with a computer problem, but he says no. How harshly would you judge him? The answer probably depends on several factors. First, you wouldn't blame him if he couldn't have acted otherwise. For example, if he was at work and his boss wouldn't let him leave, he had no choice. Second, you probably wouldn't blame him much if he could justify his actions. Perhaps he had to study for a really important exam. He could have helped out. He had some choice in the matter, but it's clear that doing so would have been really costly for him. Third, you'd probably judge him more or less harshly in rough proportion to how much harm resulted from his failure to help. You'd understandably think worse of him if you ended up failing a course because of it than if you were simply prevented from checking Facebook or surfing the internet. Finally, you wouldn't blame him much if you'd never told him just how badly you needed his help. After all, he had no way to foresee the harm his refusal might cause. This analysis of when we hold other people responsible for their actions helps us understand when we hold ourselves responsible for our behavior and experience dissonance as a result. Specifically, this analysis suggests that we ought to experience dissonance whenever we act in ways that are inconsistent with our core values and beliefs and 1. The behavior was freely chosen, 2. The behavior wasn't sufficiently justified, 3. The behavior had negative consequences, and 4. The negative consequences were foreseeable. Box 7.3, focus on intellectual history. There's a picture of Blaise Pascal. Pascal's wager, the birth of cost-benefit analysis and cognitive consistency theory. In a single stroke, Blaise Pascal, the 1600s French mathematician and Catholic philosopher, gave an impetus to both modern cost-benefit analysis, comparing the total expected costs and benefits of different options and choosing accordingly, and cognitive consistency theory. Why should people believe in God? Benefit. If God exists and we believe in God, we'll probably behave in such a way to guarantee eternal life. Cost. Not much, just foregoing a few guilty pleasures and avoiding some sins. Why should people not believe in God? Benefit. Not much, just going ahead and indulging in those pleasures and sins. Cost. Eternal damnation. Anyone who accepts the logic of these arguments would agree that it would be foolhardy not to wager that God exists and choose to believe in God. The benefits clearly outweigh the costs. Payoff matrix for Pascal's wager. Belief in God. If God exists, you get infinite gain. And if God does not exist, you get -1 finite loss. If you disbelieve in God, you get infinite loss. If God does not exist, you get +1 finite gain. The problem, however, is that logically concluding that it pays to believe in God may not be enough to make a person truly believe. Pascal recognized that some people will say, "Try as I might, I simply cannot believe. What can I do?" As a solution, Pascal appealed to a version of what we would now call cognitive consistency theory, advising non-believers to behave as believers do, pray, light candles, attend church. If they behaved in such a way, Pascal reasoned, their beliefs would change to be consistent with their behavior. Problem solved. But note that although Pascal was onto something very important about people's need for cognitive consistency, scholars such as Voltaire and Diderot had no difficulty spotting and articulating logical flaws in Pascal's argument for believing in God. Free choice. The critical role of freedom of choice was first demonstrated and replicated many times in a study in which college students were offered either 50 cents or $2.50 to write an essay in favor of a state law banning communists from speaking on college campuses. Since the original experiment was done in the mid-1960s, both payments seem low now. For comparable amounts today, it would be reasonable to multiply by a factor of 8, $4 and $20 respectively. Because the law was at variance with the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of freedom of speech, nearly all students were opposed to it, and their essays thus conflicted with their true beliefs. For half the participants, their freedom to agree or decline to write such an essay was emphasized. For the other half, it was not. There was no dissonance effect among participants for whom their freedom to agree or decline was not emphasized. Indeed, those paid $2.50 later expressed attitudes more in favor of the ban than those who paid 50 cents, presumably because writing the essay was associated with the good feelings that accompany the larger reward. In the free choice group, however, the standard dissonance effect was obtained. Those paid 50 cents changed their attitude more than those paid $2.50. If your numbers are correct, my strategic plan is irrational. Boink. Cognitive dissonance takes over. You sure are bad with numbers. What was that noise? Insufficient justification. This last experiment, like all the induced compliance studies, including Festinger and Carl Smith's original $1 or $20 study, also demonstrates the role of insufficient justification in arousing dissonance. If a person's behavior is justified by a powerful incentive of some sort, even behavior that dramatically conflicts with the person's beliefs won't produce dissonance. Those paid $2.50, about $20 today, for writing an essay that was inconsistent with their true beliefs felt no pressure to change their attitudes because their behavior was justified by the large cash payment. Those paid only 50 cents, about $4 today, had no such justification and thus felt the full weight of their behavioral inconsistency. Negative consequences. If nothing of consequence results from actions that are at variance with our attitudes and values, it's easy to dismiss them as trivial. Indeed, studies show that people experience dissonance only when their behavior results in harm of some sort. One such study, using Festinger and Carl Smith's paradigm, induced participants to tell someone, who was actually an associate working with the researchers, that a boring experiment was very interesting by offering either a small or a large incentive for doing so. Half the time, the Confederate appeared convinced that the boring task was going to be interesting, and half the time the Confederate clearly remained unconvinced. Well, you're entitled to your own opinion, but I don't think I've ever enjoyed an experiment, and I don't think I'll find this one much fun. Note that there were no negative consequences when the person appeared unconvinced. No one was deceived. So, if negative consequences are necessary for the arousal of dissonance, the standard dissonance effect should occur only when the person is convinced and the participant feels like a deceiver. That's exactly what happened. The boring task was rated more favorably only by participants who were offered little incentive to lie to another person, and the person appeared to believe the lie.